According to the United States Census Bureau, the United States is home to over 300 different languages, with some of the main ones being English, Spanish, and a variation of Chinese, like Mandarin and Cantonese. As the United States becomes home to a greater number of people who don't speak English as their first language, second language acquisition, or SLA, will become increasingly important both as a skill to learn and a skill to teach. As someone aspiring to be an English second language or ESL teacher, classes such as these are essential elements of my college education. I will now take some time to talk about some of the key lessons I've learned throughout this course. Growing up as an English language learner myself, my experience with this class may differ from native English speakers in the sense that my family and I have first-hand experience with some of the concepts explored throughout this course, even if I didn't have a name for them at the time. Take, for example, the universal grammar theory, born out of linguist Noam Chomsky's criticism of behavioralism. The universal grammar theory argues that humans are born with an inherent ability to learn languages. However, while the universal grammar theory's framework is primarily used to understand first language acquisitions in more advanced levels of SLA, it alone cannot explain the analyst's perspective on SLA. This is where the dual concepts of critical period hypothesis and fossilization take center stage. The critical period hypothesis, or CHP, argues that people are equipped with the ability to learn languages at certain periods of their lives, which usually lasts from childhood until puberty. It is during this time period that they are best able to acquire native-like mastery of a second language, or L2. This alone does not determine an individual's ability to learn a second language, as external or internal factors, such as one's educational background and personal motivations, should also be considered. CHP's linguistic opposite is fossilization, which is where an individual's ability to grasp a language reaches its limit. Coined by Larry Selinker, fossilization is an element of a greater linguistic framework known as interlanguage. Interlanguage is the stage where an individual is still developing an understanding of a second language. One of the central points behind interlanguage is to understand how an individual may learn a language and what issues they may struggle with said process. However, just like CHP argues that there is a certain time in which one is best equipped to learn an L2, fossilization argues that there is a time where that window is closed, and although an individual might continue to learn an L2, they are likely to never attain a native-like mastery of said language. It is as if a learner has hit a plateau and cannot grow in their language learning in a meaningful way. I have seen both of these concepts in action in my family and myself. My brother and I were 10 and 12 years old, respectively, when we came to the United States from Mexico. We were still within our critical periods, and within roughly a year, we were able to grasp English at a level comparable to native speakers of our age range. On the other hand, both of our parents were in their 30s when they immigrated to Kentucky, and they were well past their critical periods. Instead, they experienced a form of fossilization. Despite their best efforts and motivation to learn the language, their sentence structures remain primarily influenced by Spanish and not English. This does not mean that they cannot communicate with a native English speaker or that they don't understand English, but it does mean that their mastery of the English language will always be lesser than that of a native speaker, even if marginally so. Another concept central to my education as an ESL teacher is the contrastive analysis hypothesis, or CAH. CAH can be broken down into a weaker and strong version, both of which deal with linguistic transfers. In the field of SLA, a linguistic transfer is the influence an individual's native language, or L1, has on their ability to learn an L2. While the strong version of CAH is considered to be too academically demanding and impractical since it tries to universally predict issues language learners may have off of their relationship between their L1 and L2 and ignores the individuality of said learners. The weak version has its uses because it allows the teacher to have an understanding why an individual may be struggling with certain elements of the language. The weak version has its uses because it allows the teacher to have an understanding why an individual might be struggling with certain elements of the language they're trying to learn. In other words, the weak version does not attempt to predict problems, but create a general framework to find solutions if the problems are to arise. The two distinct forms of transfer are positive and negative ones. Positive transfers involve the similarities that might be found between two languages. This can involve similarities in syntax, grammar, or pronunciation. Positive transfers are also known as facilitators, since they help in the process of language acquisition. Inversely, negative transfers can also be known as inhibitors, since they represent a difference between one's L1 and L2 that can get in the way of their learning. An example of a positive transfer can be found in loan words, which is when one language adapts a word from another language. Consider the phonetic similarities between the Japanese word computer and the English counterpart computer. A negative transfer can be something as simple as a difference in pronunciation. For example, the letters V and B do not have any difference in the pronunciation in Spanish, which can cause confusion when Spanish speakers attempt to say words like vote and boat. As mentioned earlier in this video, motivations, both internal and external, are essential elements to consider when determining an individual's second language acquisition. This perspective reflects parts of the social-cultural perspective on SLA. Primarily developed by Lev Vygotsky, the socio-cultural linguistic theory claims that social interactions are key to the development of SLA, primarily because they encourage individuals to acquire a second language through a combination of internal and external motivators. Internal motivators reflect when the motivation to learn comes from one's own aspirations. They can be something as simple as the desire of an immigrant to speak with their peers in their new home country. Or external motivators are when the environment encourages growth. For example, the economic reality that better educational outcomes and better jobs are more easily acquired by people who can speak English at a native-like competency is an external motivator, all too familiar to immigrant families coming to the United States. The intensity of the motivation can be directly connected to the probability of successfully acquiring a language. According to the socioeconomic perspective, people with a fleeting interest in a second language, or those who do not wholly immerse themselves into the culture of the L2 they're studying, are less likely to achieve native-like proficiency in said L2. My brother and I were motivated to learn English at an early age, and we were granted the educational environment necessary to acquire a native-like level of proficiency in English. These lessons are not only academically fascinating, but practical for me. Thanks to my experience as an ELL, I've been able to help ELL students during my time as a substitute teacher and a teacher's assistant. However, the extent of my abilities have always been hampered by my academic limitations. Now I know the theory and finer details of the different SLA schools of thought and methods of teaching, which are invaluable in an ESL classroom. I've also grown in my appreciation for the interconnected nature of theory, research, and teaching. A perfect example of this was the contrastive analysis project. Through the utilization of contrastive analysis, I was able to research and find the difficulties students from multiple linguistic backgrounds can have with English. This data allowed me to come up with a lesson plan meant to help the maximum amount of students possible within the assignment's framework. These are the practical lessons that I can take into the classroom once I become an ESL teacher. Although the journey to earn my degree isn't over, this class was an essential step in that direction. This has been my presentation. Thank you for watching.